Hello, my name is Catherine Starr. Thank you for joining us from across the globe for an important and timely conversation. And thank you for joining us via YouTube for today's On the Record program. As a reminder, the Council is a nonprofit, independent, and nonpartisan platform. The views expressed by individuals it hosts are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. The Chicago Council and the Eurasia Group recently launched the first Atlas of Impunity, a comprehensive index scoring 197 countries and territories on their abuse of power across 5 key societal dimensions. The Atlas is built on 67 statistical indicators drawn from 29 validated sources, including Freedom House, Yale University, The Economist Intelligence Unit, and more. Today's discussion is part of a 4-part series of regional events in partnership with the Kofi Annan Foundation. What can a framework of impunity versus accountability tell us about the multidimensional challenges facing the Middle East and North Africa region? How are governments approaching pressing issues encompassing human rights, economic exploitation, and environmental degradation? Today we're going to dig into those questions and more. It's my great honor to introduce today's panelists who will discuss impunity in the Middle East and North Africa region. Nada El-Nashif is the UN Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights. Mark Malloch-Brown is president of the Open Society Foundation, the world's largest private funder of independent groups working for justice, democratic governance, and human rights. Suzanne Maloney is the vice president and director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. Ghassan Salameh is a Lebanese academic, politician, and diplomat, and served as the Lebanese Minister of Culture from 2000 to 2003. More of these distinguished speakers' bios can be found on the Chicago Council website, globalaffairs.org. But for now, I'd like to get into that conversation. Mark, I'd like to begin with you. You've stated that impunity and accountability are not ivory tower issues. They are very real, very present concerns for people across the globe. Can you speak to the significance of the Atlas and the importance of this impunity versus accountability lens?
Thanks, Catherine. And, I mean, first, congratulations to all those who worked on the Atlas. I think it's a very interesting attempt to sort of update some of our concepts of accountability for human rights to a new environment where governments' accountability at home is in many cases sadly weakened, but their international accountability may in some cases still be quite a lever to use on them. And one thinks, for example, of the different investigations and efforts to set up either war crimes or crime of aggression tribunals or proceedings against President Putin and the invasion of Ukraine. And in the Middle East, a region which has often had weak accountability in terms of its domestic government's accountability to its citizens, there is traditionally quite a lot of international accountability. Just to take, an extreme example, the murder of Khashoggi the accountability, or at least the way that Saudi Arabia was held to account and embarrassed in many international fora for quite a period after that. I mean, none of these things are perfect, but what it shows is that governments can be reminded that impunity carries costs in terms of their international standing, diplomatic relations, economic relations. And so, I think this index in those ways is useful. And just one last thought, I think it's also useful that it gets beyond just a sort of political and civil rights lens to look at other kinds of performance on economics, on the environment and the degradation for future generation of the country's natural capital. And in general sort of provides for many countries a more acceptable frame to assess performance than just solely a human rights, political and civil lens.
Nada, could you provide an update on the human rights situation in the Middle East and North Africa? And what are some of the key themes in accountability or impunity across the region?
Thanks very much, Catherine. It's a pleasure to be on this very distinguished panel. Yeah, the update would take a little bit of time, but let me tell you four perhaps themes that I think we are facing now. The first is perhaps what we're calling democratic backsliding, and particularly the crackdown on independent institutions, particularly judiciaries. I think a theme across the region. I'm sure Professor Salame, Minister Salame, will say more about that. Shrinking civic space, a global phenomenon, but very much in evidence in the region. The decline in freedoms, very generally. I mean by that, freedom of the press, of course, but also the freedoms of assembly and association. With many more attacks, violations against civil society actors, against political activists, women, particularly women human rights defenders in general, journalists, etc. I think that's a very big theme. Then we have, in the context of protracted violent conflict, and with it comes the trend of impunity for state actors, but also for militias and for armed groups in terms of the violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law. Again, I could give many examples, and perhaps, again, drawing on Mark's last comment about economic, social, and cultural rights, the impoverishment of entire populations. I think this phenomenon of abject poverty that we see more and more, both as a result of human rights deficits across the region, but also as a cause of further deprivation. And I think particularly because these rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, are intrinsic to the upholding of human dignity. And we see very flagrant violations across the world. So both these major trends and then many examples of where they are really working to undermine progress as a whole. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Nada. Nada mentioned threats to the judiciary, and there have been serious threats to democracy and the rule of law throughout the region, including corruption, impunity, and the erosion of democratic institutions. Could you speak more about some of these challenges and how they can be addressed?
Well, democracy is on the defensive since, I would say, 2006, 2007, across the world. You could see the trend going up until 2006. And since then, with coup d'etats in West Africa and Burkina Faso, in Guinea, in Myanmar, in Asia, in different places, you could see that what distinguishes our part of the world is the fact that we had a false dawn with the Arab Spring. That after the beginning of this regression of democracy across the world, we had a new, like a rebound or for hope, thanks to the Arab Spring. But it proved to be a false dawn. And nowadays, there is not a single country that has gone through that process of the Arab Spring that can be called democratic. But the problems are different from one part of the region to the other. In some countries, what is crucial is what kind of law. When you say a rule of law, be careful. What kind of law are you talking about? Because the law has been changed or is undergoing a big change to make it much more repressive, much less democratic. This is the case in Israel, in particular, where there is a plan by Netanyahu's government to change the constitutional framework in order to produce a more subservient Supreme Court, or at least a less independent Supreme Court from the executive. In Tunisia, it's even worse. With less than 10% voting in the referendum, the whole constitution was changed. A constitution to which I participated personally, helping the two sides to agree on it 15 years ago. So as to see it thrown from the window and replaced by a constitution that is over-presidentialist, that curtailed the judiciary's independence, etc. So you have countries where there is a clear institutional regression in terms of what kind of law we are talking about: constitutional law, legislation, etc., etc. There is a serious regression. I gave the examples of Israel and Tunisia. I could have added other countries as well, including Egypt. In other countries, you have another problem. you have a problem of entrenched kleptocracies. That is a group of people who have official positions or not, but together they have put their hands both on the political system and on the wealth of the country, and they are entrenched enough so that they cannot be moved out. The obvious case here is my country, Lebanon, but I would add other countries now run by kleptocracies, countries like Libya or like Iraq, both countries where I have served for the UN. You have in other countries, that's the third kind of countries, unending civil wars that make rule of law entirely impossible to impose. First, because you have fighting going on, or you have a divided territory, and you don't have an agreement on how things would go. The clear example here is Yemen. The other big example is Syria. Syria, where the constitutional process has gone nowhere for now 5 years. It's just a charade. The regime is not giving any leeway to come and find a new constitution. In all these countries, yes, as you said, the judiciary is in a very difficult situation, either because it's weak, or because it's slow, and therefore it is very frustrating for those who are asking the judiciary to sort of be the umpire in their private or commercial or other feuds, or it's corrupt. It is corrupt, and more often than not, it is used by the executive branch of the government in order to punish its opponents. And on this, I could give you examples almost from the 23 countries of the region, the use of the judiciary in order to curtail the political freedom of the opposition by those who are in power. So you have different kinds or categories of problems. I have given examples from different countries for these 4 or 5 different situations where the rule of law is more than problematic, is really on the defensive.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned specifically Syria and Yemen. Suzanne, I'd like to turn to Iran with you. We've seen unprecedented mass protests following the death of Mahsa Amini, a young woman killed while in police custody 6 months ago. What is the significance of these protests and their impact?
Thanks so much. Sorry.
Please. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I'm really grateful to be part of this incredibly distinguished panel, and I'm learning so much from the fellow speakers here. And I really want to praise this initiative by the Chicago Council and the Eurasia Group, which I think most importantly highlights this question of accountability and impunity, which, as the previous speaker, Seth Ghassan Salameh, really pointed out, is an issue across the region in very dramatic ways. But I also think the metrics and the kind of diversity of the metrics that the project uses are very impressive and really get to the heart of the crisis in the Middle East. Let me speak specifically to the question of Iran. I personally think we're watching something historic and extraordinary take place within the country of Iran. And it really does get to this question of a sense of frustration by the population about the inability to control various aspects of the levers of power within the system, despite consistent efforts over essentially the entirety of the 44 years of this regime to try to do so through various means, including through elections, through efforts to make public some of the abuses that have taken place through the media and other mechanisms, and none have really succeeded. And so that is why I think we saw this really dramatic response beginning in September after the news of the death of yet another young Iranian woman at the hands of the security forces on what I think was an arrest that every young Iranian person has to fear. because young women simply don't know when they leave their homes whether they're going to be harassed or detained or abused, as Mahsa Amini was, simply because of what they happen to be wearing or not wearing at that particular time. And so we've now seen more than 5 months of protests, 20,000 at least arrested, with estimates of as many as 500 who've been killed in the protests, including a string of just horrifically unjust executions that I think were deliberately undertaken to try to terrorize the population. And yet we still continue to see Iranians coming to the streets, and that is what is, I think, the most important difference from, in this particular episode, from the many prior periods of unrest that Iran has experienced. The fear factor appears to be gone to some extent. The protests are not overly large. They're relatively small scale, but they're happening around the country, and they've been inflamed again over the course of the past several weeks as news of these very mysterious poisonings, apparently by gas, of young schoolgirls in schools across the country in Iran. And there's really no possibility that such an undertaking could have been done without the complicity of the security forces. None of this, I think, threatens the near-term viability of the Iranian regime, but it's very clear that the system is on the defensive, that it doesn't know how to respond to this uprising, which has elicited the support not just of significant Iranian political and cultural figures, but interest and sympathy and support from around the world. And I think that is particularly important in terms of ensuring that individuals in Iran and elsewhere in the region understand that their voices are being heard, that their demands for accountability on the part of their own leaders are heard and echoed and reinforced by the world powers and the rest of the international community. I'll stop there, but look forward to continuing the conversation.
Gaston, did you have something to say?
No, thank you.
Okay. Just a reminder to our audience listening around the world, if you have any questions for us, please visit ccga.live to ask those questions, and we'll get to them in our Q&A portion later in this conversation. So, Suzanne, you did mention that international community too. And Mark, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the international community and the response, both to events like what we see happening in Iran and in the region as a whole. The international community is often criticized for being complacent on impunity and human rights violations in the region. What role can the international community play here?
Well, I think one has to recognize it has its limits, that we're living in an era where national sovereignty is robuster than at times, and the ability of governments to be embarrassed less. I think it goes back to that democratic deficit that Hassan was talking about, which has been running since 2006 or so. We are living in an era of shameless government, basically, around much of the world. And so, Nada, as Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, is struggling with this all the time because, condemnation in the Human Rights Council is not something that makes that many governments lose sleep at night. And so in that sense, it's a challenged world. But having said that, it's often a little bit more progress can be made internationally than can be made domestically, particularly in countries which sort of lock up human rights defenders, etc. The international stage offers some place to, raise issues, occasionally move towards sanctions of different kinds against countries and leaders. So imperfect though it is a critical component to accountability and fighting impunity. I think we'd all love to see a stronger international system, and it may be that we've got to recognize that a solely governmental system will never be better than some of the worst governments, and we need to focus some of our activities on the civil society dimensions of holding governments to account, and we need to try and press corporates to make their investment decisions more aligned with questions of rule of law and political stability in countries, and find entry points of self-interest for them to want to sort of study the Impunity Atlas and have it influence their commercial decisions. So I think there are a range of international levers and actors available, but we equally have got to be realistic that their effect is good and important, but not as great as one might hope.
And if anyone else has something to add here, feel free to jump in. All right, Nada, I have a question for you next on about the issue of impunity versus accountability and how we connect this with the fight against inequality. What actions can propel us towards more just, accountable, and equitable societies?
Thank you, Katie. Maybe just to finish up the thought with Mark, I think it's true that we do need national ownership for it to really work. But obviously, in the absence of that, I think the international human rights mechanisms continue to provide very important roadmaps. And again, as long as they are on the radar screen internationally, whether in the Human Rights Council or other places, I think we need a kind of cooperation with these investigative mechanisms, particularly in the region. And we have seen them produce some results, although they are not very sustainable. So just to say, one of the biggest challenges in this area is the administration of justice. We've already heard that. And one of the biggest challenges in that is the challenge of access. And I think that, well, we have worldwide about 1.5 billion people who have unmet criminal, civil, or administrative justice needs. This goes to the heart of the inequality, deeply embedded structural inequalities and patterns of discrimination, particularly in this area of access. So where these cultures of impunity have absolutely taken over, and Hassan gave quite a few examples, then this violation of individual and collective rights becomes very easy. It's a daily issue, and it reinforces inequality and marginalization. And I want to say particularly for those who face compounded exclusions. So if you are a religious, racial, or a minority facing a gender identity challenge, then all of this is really very expanded. How to go forward? Of course, we believe political transitions need to put human rights at the center to be part of the solution, including, of course, creating environments that are more conducive to accountability. And looking at some of the dimensions again in the Atlas's measurement of impunity, I want to say we also need more human rights enhancing economies. Mark mentioned this, but again, those where the objective of advancing human rights informs all others, including economic decision-making, fiscal decision-making, investments, monetary and business decisions. So I think taken all together, we might have a better chance at delivering, again, more equitable societies.
The explosion in Beirut's port in August 2020 led to widespread public anger and protests, with many calling for accountability. 2.5 years later, it's on the verge of being a failed state after an unprecedented economic collapse. Can you speak about the situation?
Well, this explosion in the port of Beirut came as the cherry on the cake to three big problems the country was facing and is still facing very seriously. The first one is a big Ponzi scheme that basically exploded in 2019 and deprived most depositors, especially in the middle class, of most of their savings and access to their own money. Because the banking system has gone down and because the government is not able to make for it. So you have now a situation where a large chunk of the middle class is under the poverty line. In fact, you have a dollarization of the economy that benefits, like, I would say, at best 15% of the population, while the other 85% are in very serious need of help, which was not the case of a country that had a rather decent GNP per capita so far. The second problem the country is facing is a very serious, deep political crisis. You have a presidency that is vacant. There is no president of Lebanon right now. You have a government that is a caretaking government with very limited powers and with most of the time inability to meet because some people do not want it to meet. And you have a parliament that is to a large extent in the hands of the banking association. So you have a situation that is extremely difficult because you do not have a decision-making process that is institutional, constitutional, accepted, legal. So rule of law in this vacancy of the presidency, caretaking cabinet, etc., becomes a joke. And you have a third problem, which I already mentioned and was mentioned by others as well, Nada and others, is the situation of the judiciary. The judiciary cannot really freely do its job when it comes to the explosion of the port of Beirut, because the political class has enough means to pressure the judge in question and to pressure his superiors so that they contain him. For a whole year now, that judge in charge of inquiring about the port explosion has been at home, unable to even get to his office. So that tells you something about the situation of the judiciary, which is divided, which is largely corrupt, and which is very much under the orders of the executive. So you have the three problems at the same time. The Ponzi scheme that imploded, the political crisis that has becoming much more severe since the end of the term of the previous president, and you have a judiciary you cannot count on. That is why Lebanon is in very deep crisis right now. I don't see a light at the end of the tunnel soon. And unfortunately, I don't see a revival of what you mentioned. That is all these guys, the young guys, many of them my own students who went into the streets in order to call for accountability. There is something like a fatigue among them, like a fatalism, because basically they haven't been able to win on neither one of the three chapters I mentioned, the banking one, the political one, nor the judicial one.
Thank you, Ghassan. It's unfortunate to hear no light at the end of the tunnel. I would like to end this portion of our conversation before we move to the Q&A with a question for everyone that's perhaps a little more hopeful. Again, with a reminder to our audience that if you have questions for our live Q&A, please visit ccga.live and ask that question. So opening this up to everybody here, what are some examples then of successful efforts to address impunity and promote accountability in this region? And are there any lessons that can be learned?
I'm happy to go first in the absence of people jumping to the microphone. Only really to remember that it's just over 20 years since the Arab Human Development Reports were published, which Nada and I cooperated on, and Ghassan was an unofficial advisor to, if I recall correctly, in those days. And you know, here was an effort by authors from the region to take advantage of an international UN publication to, you know, bring a spotlight to bear on the shortcomings in the region, not just in human rights, but gender, environment, education, a whole array of social ills. And, you know, many believe that, you know, some of the fire that was lit then led in small part to the Arab Spring some years later. And, you know, so I think it shows this issue of when particularly you have national ownership, but you know, prevented at home from bringing people to account, finds an international outlet and a way of mobilizing both home opinion via an international megaphone and an international audience via that megaphone as well. And, you know, I'm very struck now running OSF how many of our Middle East grantees are sadly not living in their countries of origin, living in Europe or North America or, adjacent to the region ideally, but just simply not able to operate in their own countries because of the insecurity they personally face, and yet who are able to nevertheless run extraordinary programs of trying to hold their governments to account. So, above all else, I just see human ingenuity and courage of several generations now of young leaders in the MENA region who've just refused to give up and have, kept pressing for greater accountability of their government and pushing back against impunity.
Can add, I'm sure, just a quick one, but I mean, we did work, and as Ghassan said, Tunisia in particular, I think, was one of the early lights of promise and hope of the Arab Spring. I would say that hope has been dashed almost completely now, but I think in the immediate aftermath, we did see, for example, this setting up of specialized criminal chambers in Tunisia. Again, based in transitional justice law, looking at huge, gross human rights violations, as well as corruption and misuse of public funds and so on. And over a period of time, starting with 2014, when they were established, they did actually manage to involve a very large number of victims. They did manage to engage, including with perpetrators. And this specialized criminal chambers is the only transitional justice mechanism still functional in Tunisia, with actually processes of trial and hearing victims and witnesses and so on. Now, there have been not many verdicts because of the way that things have moved on, but victims, their legal representatives, civil society organizations have all continued to support the role. I think obviously without political will at the heart, it is very difficult. Ghassan mentioned the lengthy delays in judicial procedures, justice delays, justice denied, obviously. The legal frameworks themselves have been, I think, revised in a downward direction, not inadequate protection. So I think we learned the need for, I think, more resources to sustain some of these experiments, really, and the need for specializations and then managing the expectations of victims, all of which has been very tricky. So there have been a few across the region, none of which I'm afraid have really sustained the pressure of time and these regressive forces that have united against these potential, I think, catalysts of change in a more equitable direction.
Thank you, Nada. All right, we'd like to move now to our Q&A portion of this conversation. Suzanne, I have a question here for you from an audience member, and this is about the role of young people in the region. Young people constitute more than 55% of the population across the Middle East and North Africa. The 2022 Arab Youth Report found that an overwhelming 82% of youth across the region stated that stability in their country was more important than promoting democracy. Why do you think that is, and what role do you see the youth of this region playing in the impunity versus accountability conversation?
Yeah, I think it's an unfortunate finding, but it's I'm sure quite valid because, of course, the connection that young Arabs have experienced over the course of certainly since, as Mark Malloch-Brown noted, the publication of the Arab Development Report has been that democracy has tended to come at the hands of disruptive change, at times with the intervention or precipitating the intervention of outside powers. And it has proven either ephemeral or it has been contorted or distorted by powerful constituencies within and outside of the country. And so democracy hasn't led to what I think that the poll and some of the other research that's been done, including as part of this project, suggests that young people in the Middle East are really looking for, which is a better life. A better life isn't simply about the framework of democracy, although that is certainly part of it. A better life for young people and a better future for countries in the region relies on good governance, on accountability, on economic opportunity, and on the sustainable use of resources, which is why I think, the sort of metrics that the Atlas uses are so important. I think what we see from some of these results is that, young people really do understand, the distinction between their own experience and that of those in other parts of the world. They want opportunities for political voice through elections. They want representative institutions and the separation of powers. But they also recognize that that simply isn't the only mechanism for securing the future that will benefit them and benefit their own countries. And so, you find that in some countries, people are sort of disaffected from politics as a whole. They're looking for other avenues to create change, whether that's economic activity, whether that's becoming more involved in conservation movements. The difficulty there is that, some of these repressive governments, including the government of Iran, sees those very activities as a direct threat to its own control and its own power. And so I think, we really have a need to continue to work with the region to demonstrate avenues for progress. As Mark Malloch Brown was noting, so many people who are working for change are outside their countries, but they're doing a lot of good. I look at the projects, again, kind of coming back to the country I know best, Iran. Look at the work of Maziar Bahari, who runs a website for citizen journalists that has pioneered and broken important news stories and held Iranian leaders to accountability by working with people inside the country. Also the work of Masih Alinejad, another journalist who left Iran after 2009 and was one of those who really was highlighting the unfair and repressive nature of the hijab laws in Iran. And so I think that, working with people who really do understand the conditions on the ground and who create pathways for change, there will be change.
Mark, is that what you see too in your work in the region?
Yeah, no, absolutely, we see that. We, as I say, both people, principally people outside, but they have audiences inside. I mean, Iran wouldn't be moving if there weren't a lot of young Iranians, particularly women, who weren't responding to these messages. So I think it's a sort of inside-outside strategy that has to combine, just because of the nature of the sort of authoritarian governments across so much of the region.
Another question from our audience member here is, how can we encourage accountability in more restrictive contexts like the Gulf monarchies?
Well, I mean, we started by giving the Khashoggi example, which is an extreme example. And, sadly, I think, there are many other human rights abuses which do not get that kind of spotlight put upon them. And, I think it's, it's often challenging. These are countries with, significant sized migrant populations across the construction and services sectors. And I would just say that, Nader, I don't mean to throw you under the bus on this, but given that you were responsible at the ILO before you came, the Human Rights Commission for sort of migrant and labor rights in the Middle East, you may be the better person to answer this question.
Yeah, well, I think definitely one aspect of it is the constructive engagement that comes from technical support, simply. I mean, I think there has to be an incentive There has to be an international vigilance, a sense of, where we're making progress. But I think certainly on this issue of migrant workers, it's very, very deliberate. It was an incremental growth strategy in terms of the rights agenda, working again with many, many different constituents, including creating national trade union movements, including looking at some of the levers of change, as we said before, and building through human rights instruments, by the way, conventions and ratifications of agreements and understandings and legal frameworks to make sure that we could arrive at where we are. And I think there have been some gains. If we look at the Qatar hosting of recently of the FIFA, again, that was a huge experiment. I think for many, there was a lot of watchfulness, but I think the transparency in many ways helped push an agenda of inclusion, I think, of engagement around positive values, which is what we always want to do. And we ended up, I think, all of us in a much better place. Of course, the work has not stopped. It will continue. But big sporting and other events like that sometimes afford the opportunity of engagement, towards win-win situations, I think.
Interesting point. I'd like to finish with a couple questions here now on the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So this December, it's going to be the 75th anniversary of this document. And opening it up to everyone here, what is the importance and relevance even of the UN Declaration of Human Rights in today's world?
I'm not sure. I have the hopeful answer, and then maybe we can. I just want to say that for us, obviously, the birth of the declaration came out of the despair, in a way, of the unprecedented depths of World War II. And I think the hope is now, as we all came together then, drawing very much on the values deeply rooted in all belief, in all culture. It was not an imposition of values from one part of the world to the other. It was really about reaffirming universal dignity and rights for all. I think what we want to do now, this year particularly, and we're running an initiative throughout the whole year, is to try to invoke the spirit of the declaration and trying to put together some of the responses anchored in human rights to face this staggering inequalities, the climate emergency, this pervasive impunity that we've been talking about, and trying to understand how we can overcome division and polarization, of which we see far too much, to renew commitment. That is the hope. Using human rights as the common language of our shared humanity. I don't know how it seems to, Hassan, those who have been around with a lot more insight and some cynicism, perhaps.
No, not really cynicism, but the fact that I have serious doubts about the very existence of an international community. I believe to have a community, you need a higher level of solidarity and a higher level of concern, from the rich toward the poor, from the democratic towards those who live under authoritarian regime. I'm not seeing much of it. In order to encourage those countries we were talking about, I think what stands for the international community, that is mainly Western Europe and the United States, need to be more exemplary. The Europeans need to treat the migrants across the Mediterranean in a different manner. And it's also the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, and some Americans should think about what they did in Iraq before what the Iraqis are doing to themselves right now. So we need also some kind of self-reflection of the so-called international community about what it has been doing. Same with the judiciary. I am unhappy with the judiciary in my country and in other Arab countries, but we went for the assassination of our Prime Minister Hariri to a special international tribunal. It costed $1 billion. It took 10 years, and it ended up with a very ambiguous sentence at the very end. So there is a frustration here. There is a frustration not only with the national institution, but also with what the international community is doing what the ICC is doing or not doing, what the special tribunals are doing or not doing, and the kind of solidarity that is needed sometimes and not shown in very dramatic situations like the boat people in the Mediterranean.
Mark, Suzanne, any final comments?
Well, I trust Hassan to wait till almost the last moment to cast this broadside at the international community, because I think it's a fascinating point, and one actually which you should have up front in your future seminars on this, because, you know, people like me are counting on some level of conscience in the international community to make up for domestic oppression as a platform and an audience to which to take these charges of impunity and to seek accountability. So if the international community has fallen so far below expectations that it doesn't even merit the term community anymore, that's a big hole in the waterline of our model. And I'm sorry to say, I think he has a point. You know, I was careful to say that I think you get a sort of sporadic, partial response from the international community, not an organized government one, but that you can get corporates to hold back investment, you can get civil society to condemn. But it's a very scattershot, imperfect response. And what we do need is the statesmanship and leadership from the West and from the democratic countries and the human rights sensitive countries of the developing world as well, which is evidently missing at the moment. You know, this is a highly world of national self-interest, not a world of community at the moment.
I'll just perhaps try to send us out on maybe a slightly positive note, although I agree wholeheartedly with everything that the prior speakers have said about the international community. I do think the example of removing the Iranian government from the UN Council on the Status for Women was an important one. Primarily symbolic in terms of what it accomplished, but that symbolism alone is, I think, a reinforcing mechanism for the unity of the international community and the credibility of international organizations. That when you have a government that is so obviously and routinely abusing women, they should not be holding a position on a council that is addressed to women's issues. And so it's one small step, but one that I hope we can replicate in other arenas.
Lots of food for thought here. I want to thank all of our distinguished panelists for joining us today, and to you, our audience tuning in from around the world, for being here for this important and timely conversation. We do have upcoming regional events discussing the Atlas of Impunity and having these same kind of questions to dig into here, especially about the role of the international community, which I'm really glad that we raised here today. To learn more about the upcoming events, please visit globalaffairs.org. And again, thank you to everyone for being here. Have a good day.